Let's turn now to gun violence plaguing this country. The latest, a shooting in the San Pedro neighborhood of Los Angeles. 2 people were killed and 5 were injured when shots rang out during a car show and baseball game. The latest victims of gun violence. It is something the Stevens family knows all too well. Last May, as Lance Stevens was doing yard work and his mother was dropping off his sons from a sleepover, a random shooting shattered their quiet life. Lance and his mother were seriously injured, the 2 young children traumatized. Trymaine Lee traveled to Indianapolis to learn more about their story.
Nice shot, man.
Indianapolis couple, Lance Stevens and his wife, Sophia, tried to build their lives around avoiding violence, carefully selecting a home in a neighborhood where they thought they could raise their young sons in relative safety. But last May, a stranger with a gun found them anyway, piercing the family's peaceful suburban life. In a blink, 39-year-old Lance and his mother, Kim Tillman, joined the estimated 100,000 other Americans who survive gun violence each year.
He pulled a gun in my son's head.
Lance was shot in the head and leg. Kim, who was dropping off her grandsons after a sleepover, caught a wave of bullets in her arms, chest, and face.
I don't even know why he came over there and why he shot us.
Lance and Kim are among the nearly 750 people who were shot in Indianapolis last year who survived.
This is dead right here. My implant is here, but down here, this is all dead.
Your arm, your chest, and under your jaw.
Yeah.
Kim has permanent scarring from bullets that punctured her face, shattering her jawbone and several teeth.
At what point did you realize just how badly you've been injured?
I kind of still don't even realize it now.
Wounds you can see, but also wounds that you can't.
I had terrible nightmares, just waking up, thinking people were gonna shoot me.
Lance and Sophia's 3- and 6-year-old sons were there that day. Neither boy was harmed physically, but both are processing trauma. The oldest boy, LJ, saw his father stumble into the house.
And he's already seeing me, my head bleeding. My son's like, I don't want to be without you. He's saying like, I don't want you to die.
Their younger son was asleep in the back seat of his grandmother's car, bullets whizzing around him. The family assumed the 3-year-old saw nothing. In therapy, they learned he'd been stuffing it down.
He just unloaded, and we were amazed.
There are other costs, too. Repairs to the Stevens' bullet-riddled home, the loss of a vehicle, and the family says $35,000 in medical bills combined. As the family tries to move on and make sense of what happened, I asked what they'd say to lawmakers who are reluctant to make gun reforms a priority.
Shame on you. Just shame on them. Unless it actually hits home, maybe to their kids, their grandmother, you know? Maybe if it hits home to them and they can actually see it.
Woo!
Through it all, they still find hope and light. And they're standing up where bullets almost took them down.
Welcome back. So this Black History Month comes at a time where the actual teaching of Black history has become a very contentious issue. We are seeing multiple states restricting how race is taught in public schools, but so much of that history resonates strongly today. MSNBC's Trymaine Lee and the Into America podcast team are taking a deep dive into the legacies of the Reconstruction era in the United States and how it continues to shape this country. And Trymaine is joining us now. Trymaine, you and your team, you took a look at 2 communities, one in South Carolina, one in Georgia as well, a link really to the past and then to the present. Tell us about what you saw.
Yasmin, what I found is that while over time so many hopes and dreams have faded, others have been passed down from one generation to the next. And among those generations' dreams are literally owning a piece of America to call your own, owning land. Here's more.
Along Highway 10 in rural South Carolina, there's a town called Promised Land. It was founded in 1870, a safe place for and by formerly enslaved people, after newly elected Black lawmakers created a commission that would sell land and, by extension, independence to black people when others wouldn't.
What year does that say?
1883.
Reverend Willie Neal Norman Jr. is a Promised Land descendant.
When people ask me, where are you from? I tell them I live in the Promised Land, but I'm en route to the Promised Land.
4 million African Americans emerged from the Civil War, finally free, determined to reunite with family and build new lives from scratch.
I know during Reconstruction, there was a big effort to reunite with family.
Absolutely.
An exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, focusing on Reconstruction and its legacies, explores their journey. This month, MSNBC and the Into America podcast are teaming up with the museum for a rare glimpse behind the glass and into this special retelling of Black history.
What we have here are some of the items that were part of the history, and it reminds us that these are everyday people who are just trying to survive.
From the late 1800s through the early 20th century, free Black people established more than 1,200 settlements and towns across the Deep South and West. Promised Land, South Carolina, is one of the few that still exists.
I think it's a very much American credo. You want to have land, you want to have the chance to make your own choices.
Reverend Norman's wife, Elistine, is another descendant of Promised Land's early settlers.
That longing to be able to have your own, and that's what was instilled from the generations on down.
Deep in rural Georgia, about 2 hours southeast of Atlanta, Ashley Scott is leading a group of 19 Black families in modern-day Black town building.
We want to create a community where people are not just making it, but being able to thrive versus just survive.
The dream is Freedom, Georgia. The families purchased 500 acres of old timberland that they hope to turn into a Black Mecca, where all residents share an economic stake. And instead of a traditional police force, a peace force, offering social services first, handcuffs second.
We hope that Freedom will be a foundation for building our own institutional structures so that racism is not there from its origination.
A new generation of Black families, rooted in the hopes of yesterday, but reaching toward the promises of tomorrow.
While Freedom, Georgia may be years away from ushering its first residents, the organizers hope that by linking the past with the present, they'll create a new Black future. Yasmin?
For the better part of 2 centuries, America has been at war, not always with guns and bullets, but in our history books, over the stories that America tells itself about who we truly are. As the world shook beneath the weight of the system that crushed George Floyd, right-wing lawmakers and Republican-led legislatures across the country have passed a slew of so-called critical race theory laws that make teaching lessons on racism, the role of Black people in American history, and of aspects of slavery and white resistance to equality impossible. No state has been on the front lines of America's seething war with itself and its truths more than Texas.
They don't think that America is, or should be, categorized as the greatest country in the history of the world.
In September of 2021, Governor Greg Abbott signed a law that bans teaching history that could cause, quote, discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of a student's race. With the stroke of a pen, books have been banned or pulled from shelves. Civic engagement programs have been canceled. Teachers can face firing and other discipline for teaching in a manner outside of what's been prescribed by the state.
You're asking me to forget what actually happened, to forget about Jim Crow? Are you telling me to forget about the lynchings that took place right here in Texas?
This whitewashing has become so insidious, so far-reaching, that the Texas Board of Education fielded a proposal to substitute the word slavery for involuntary relocation. As we visit historically Black colleges and universities ahead of the 2022 midterms, we look to the students who are pushing back on these pseudo-historical narratives.
I believe that it is our responsibility as not only HBCU students, but as Black Americans to make sure that our history is not forgotten, that it is heard, that it is understood, and that it is used to create a better nation for all.
Because after all, it was Texas Southern University students who took a stand 60 years ago to do just that by staging Houston's first sit-in at an all-white lunch counter to dismantle racist segregation laws. Today, TSU students are learning and living the legacy.
I think that is more so for us as students of color and African American students is that we want to make sure that our history is still embedded into curriculums across the board, not just for us, but to understand this is where America was and this is where we are now. And this is why things are the way they are.
And for the way things were and are now, how do we prepare for the next chapter in our own story?
Welcome to Into America, the Power of the Black Vote. I'm Trymaine Lee. Over the next several weeks, we're traveling to HBCUs all across the South to hear from young Black voters on what matters most to them. And we're honored to kick things off right here at Texas Southern University. Let's give it up. The lessons we learn in classrooms just like the one we're in shapes how we see ourselves and how we see America, and in so many ways, how America sees us. The aggressive stance that America's political right has taken on school curriculum ahead of the midterm elections in November could signal a major setback for racial equality and progress in this country. And as we're here among our next teachers and policymakers and truth tellers, how do we decide whose story matters and what history is told? Here to help us unpack what's at stake, please welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones, creator of the groundbreaking 1619 Project. NBC News senior investigative reporter Mike Hixenbaugh. He recently won a Peabody for reporting on the culture wars. He's based right here in Houston. Esteemed educator from San Antonio, Akeem Brown, who has faced the wrath of the state's latest restrictions. And last, but certainly not least, let's give it up for one of your own, TSU Student Government Association President, Dexter Maryland. So let's just jump right in, Nikole. Why is it so dangerous to tell the truth in America? Why is it so important to keep American history shrouded in this kind of mythology?
That's a great question. That's a 2-hour lecture, but I'll try to keep it short. What we kind of typically think about as history is really memory. So it's kind of how do we as a society collectively think about ourselves? How do we think about our history? And that history tends to be very managed and manipulated to justify existing hierarchies, to justify power, right? So we all know that we are raised with the narrative of American exceptionalism, that we are the greatest and freest society in the history of the world. So how does one hold that in your hand and the fact that we were founded on settler colonialism, genocide, and slavery at the same time? So what we do is we marginalize those stories as, yes, it happened, but it's insignificant.
You know, beyond simple ignorance, right? What's at stake here? Why does it matter, certainly to Black Americans, but also white folks who are consuming some of this same mythology?
What matters is we have all been taught the history of a country that does not exist. So the history of the country we've been taught doesn't explain January 6th. It doesn't explain why you have legislatures all over the country that are trying to make it more difficult to vote. While you have one political party that's now saying, well, if democracy is not majority white, we may not actually believe in democracy anymore. So we've been taught the history of a mythological country that leaves us really ill-prepared to deal with the challenges of our society. When you get a more real and accurate history, then you know how to meet the challenges that we're facing. You know, of course, I would argue that if we have a truly great nation, we can withstand the truth. that a great nation doesn't have to pretend that it hasn't done the things that it's done.
Mike, and this certainly isn't just philosophical, right? There are real-world implications, and it's been politicized.
A lot of the aim behind these bills is, okay, you can teach about slavery, you can teach that those things exist. They have explicit language that says you can't say what Nicole reported, which is that slavery was foundational to the country. What they don't want is for that history to be connected with current events. They don't want you to teach children, white children, that they are responsible for past sins. Now, I haven't found anyone in all of my reporting who has taught that to a kid. I haven't heard a teacher say, the white half of this class, you did slavery, it's your fault.
And one state lawmaker who wrote Texas' anti-CRT bill recently addressed the Board of Education. I want to quote this directly. He said, "No one is saying that we don't have systemic racism, but what we're saying is we've made a lot of progress. We have a long way to go, but the way to get there here is to come together as Americans." And I want to ask you, you hear that, what is this bill actually trying to do?
Well, first of all, his quote is inaccurate. There are lots of people, and I've heard from them, who say systemic racism doesn't exist. That is at the center of the argument. And in terms of his comments that this doesn't stop us from teaching about racism, one of the main critiques of these bills, not just in Texas, but across the country, is they're written in somewhat vague terms, and it leaves a lot open for interpretation. So, there's all of these educators across the country who are trying to figure out, how do I do this? And it's led to, I think, a form of soft censorship, even if they're saying you can teach about history.
From your reporting on the impulses of this, do you buy that they actually believe this, or is this political strategy?
Beginning in 2020, we had maybe a 4-day span in 2020 where the whole country was like, Black Lives Matter. Amazon was putting out statements and school boards were passing resolutions. And I think Republicans, following Donald Trump's lead, saw that you can get a lot of people really animated when you say, this movement is dangerous to America. They're coming for your schools, they're coming for your children, they're coming for your suburbs. And so you've seen that just take off. And the reason it's effective, though, is because people at the local level, this is resonating with them. White suburban moms hear these messages and they think that my kid is at risk.
Dexter, I want to ask you this, man. The same people who are writing these laws are the same ones approving funding for publicly funded institutions like this one here. Do you think in the midst of this broader political fight over CRT in 1619 that the mission of a school like this could be undermined?
You know what, I was actually just thinking about that. It's disheartening because, and you all talked about that as well, the history of historically Black colleges and universities. What does that look like with these laws in place? And it's fearful for me because I was in an African American studies class before these laws were made. And I was able to learn about my identity. And there are some students in the audience that was in that class with me. And to truthfully stand on what is being Black in America, what is African American in America. And with these laws being put in place, what does that look like for our future? And I think that it's really leaning more so towards fear of our generation learning true history and becoming the change makers that we want to see in the world. And I don't think they want to see that.
Welcome back. In his series, The Power of the Black Vote, NBC News correspondent Trymaine Lee and his Into America podcast team take us inside historically Black colleges and universities ahead of the midterms.
This week, the team is visiting the third largest HBCU in the country, Florida A&M University, and they went there to learn how students are working to tackle climate change in some very unique ways. And Trymaine joins us now from Tallahassee, Florida, home of FAMU. So you got the chance to tag along with the student researchers there. What did you find, Trymaine?
I'll tell you what, Craig, of all the issues that motivate young people to the polls, it's often not necessarily the environment that's always top on their list, but here with students who are part of the School of the Environment, that's what they care most about. But they're also not waiting around on politicians to make change. They're actually doing some really critical research, as you mentioned, on oysters. It's pretty impressive, pretty ingenious. Let's take a look.
On a bright Saturday afternoon, under a clear Tallahassee sky, students from Florida A&M University's School of the Environment are heading out to their classroom. And their classroom is Appalachia Bay, Today's lesson, oysters are allies in the fight against climate change. They help clean polluted waters, and over time, mature oyster reefs mitigate coastal flooding.
When the water rises or when storms happen, those oyster bars keep the storm water from coming too much into shore. So that's why oysters are so important.
Last week, surges from Hurricane Ian devastated Florida's Gulf Coast. While the bays near Tallahassee were not directly hit in this storm, it is one of the most surge-prone areas in the country. The region has a rich history of oyster fishing, but overharvesting and rising water temperatures have depleted populations. The students are using the data-gathering buoy called the Rattler-Moji to study them.
Salinity, UV, nitrogen levels, phosphorus levels, emphasis on the phrase.
Tallahassee native and recent FAMU grad Jordan Roberts helped launch the buoy project.
If you're breathing, you're affected by climate change. You're affected by climate chaos. But if you're Black and breathing, you're disproportionately directly affected by climate chaos.
She now works at the school's Sustainability Institute and mentors younger students, like Ben Johnson, who's a fourth-year environmental studies major.
Seeing the representation for people that look like me to be in this field is big for me. It's a ton of fish.
And the president of FAMU's fishing club.
Fishing is like a networking thing, so people might have job opportunities for these students. Pitch it out.
More than half of Gen Zers and millennials say climate change is affecting their local community. That's especially true for young Black Americans, who often come from areas more likely to be impacted by air pollution, flooding, and extreme heat.
When these water levels and things start to rise and land starts to just warp and stuff, it's these Black and brown neighborhoods and these minority communities who are in these places that are directly affected by these things.
This summer, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes $369 billion for climate and energy programs and tackles environmental justice priorities. Democrats hope the law might draw young Black voters to the polls.
When you're thinking about voting for a politician, what's your checklist?
At the top of my checklist is always where their head is at with environmental policy. If they get elected, how are they going to affect my community? Like my community, Black and brown people, minority people, and environmentally. Those are the top two things that I look at when I'm voting, period.
That's dope.
But for the students at FAMU, change starts with them.
Why does this matter, this work?
I know the big thing is climate change and what problems it's causing in different parts of the world. So using the buoy helps us give us a little insight on what's actually going on.
The fate of these oysters and the communities that call Florida's Gulf Coast home might just depend on the Rattler-Moji and the young scientists behind it, carrying the future in their hands.
Completely man-powered. How we get the cases out is what you're seeing right now.
Within days of the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, Macy Brown, a junior at Jackson State University, had a plan to deliver bottled water to Jackson residents who couldn't afford to get it on their own.
Where is this water coming from?
People.
Macy formed the Mississippi Students Water Crisis Advocacy Team. She says they've delivered 1,500 cases of water so far.
Yeah, you guys put them down over here.
Macy sees a connection between laws and policies aimed at diluting the voting power of Black Mississippians, who make up nearly 40% of the state's population, and Jackson's failing infrastructure.
We think of racism as, just a police officer we see brutalizing somebody on TV, or like a Confederate flag being a part of a state flag, but not thinking about the way that our water systems are maintained or not maintained and how that's ingrained in racism as well.
Robert Luckett is a history professor at Jackson State.
Frankly, the civil rights movement never ended.
He traces Jackson's water problems to the 1970s and the forced desegregation of the public schools, when white families fled Jackson for the suburbs rather than integrate so their children could attend all-white private schools.
And when they withdraw from the city of Jackson, so too does their support for all things Jackson, and the infrastructure, and schools, roads, and healthcare, and water systems.
For decades, Black people in Mississippi have risked and, in many cases, given their lives fighting for the rights and freedoms that America had promised. It's history that's not lost on Macy and fellow Jackson State students planning an on-campus voting event.
Why is it so important to make sure that you're getting out there and getting people engaged in the voting process?
Jackson is a prime example of when you're not out voting in your local elections, a lot of things that you would think are a natural born right, like clean water, is not.
But in Mississippi, where despite being the blackest state in America, no black person has been elected statewide since Reconstruction, getting people to the polls is only part of the fight.
Voting itself is not enough. You have to be involved on like every front of the political, advocacy space, not just on election day, because the other side has been conspiring forever to get to that point. They've been doing the work outside of the voting booth, so we have to kind of do the same. We are like
And for Macy, taking on the fight to reclaim power is second nature.
Are you an activist?
I kind of prefer organizer because I feel as if we're kind of overusing the word activist for when people do just things that they're supposed to do.
Aaron, voting rights and access to the polls is still a serious problem here in Mississippi, but students like Macy and other organizations are hoping that with so many serious issues on the ballot this year, that something might push folks to the polls. That's what they're hoping. Aaron.
Welcome back. Turning now to Maryland, where a fight over a multi-million-dollar land development deal has uncovered a mostly forgotten historically black cemetery. Descendants of the formerly enslaved people who are buried there are now fighting to preserve their ancestors' legacy. Here's NBC News correspondent Trymaine Lee.
Oh, yeah.
78-year-old Harvey Matthews grew up on a small farm in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C.
That tree is the one that my mom and my dad planted. Right there, when I was about 9 years old.
Back then, most families in the surrounding areas were black, descended from newly emancipated African Americans who settled here shortly after the Civil War. For nearly a century, they prospered. But in the decades to come, most of it would be erased in the name of progress, just not theirs.
The Venables came in and started stealing the blacks from their homes and driving them away from their homes. And then as they did that, the community got smaller and smaller.
Today, the farm where Matthews grew up is a strip mall.
Is it hard to believe that this community that you grew up in is now this?
Yes, it's hard. This was home at one time. And now it's everything else but that.
Down River Road, the 102-year-old Moses Macedonia Baptist Church, wedged between a bank and a high-rise, is the last visible remnant of the once thriving black community. Marcia Coleman Adebayo is the pastor's wife.
Everyone asks me, what is this little black church doing in the middle of downtown Bethesda? And the question is, what are you doing here? This church has been here for 102 years.
Now, another sacred piece of the community's history is in jeopardy. The land where the Moses Macedonia African Cemetery once stood is up for sale.
So we're going.
Harvey and Marcia believe this area, bulldozed and paved over in the 60s, is the resting place for as many as 500 ancestors.
We will fight every single day to make sure that you are remembered and you're respected.
They formed the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition and won a court injunction blocking Montgomery County, which owns the land, from selling it to an investor. The County Planning Commission has appealed the ruling.
Well, we say you stand on holy ground.
The dispute highlights a growing nationwide movement by descendants and historians to find, preserve, and memorialize black burial grounds, often the only remaining proof of lost black communities.
This struggle is a struggle demanding, not asking, but demanding that our humanity is respected, and we are determined to win this struggle.
And our thanks to Trymaine for that report. The Bethesda African American Burial Commission has been granted a temporary injunction blocking Montgomery County from going forward with the sale of the cemetery land. They want it to be given back to the descendants so they can build a museum or a memorial. In a statement to NBC News, the county says it is working on getting the facts about the cemetery and will be working to get a, quote, unbiased professional archaeological study of the site.